Great case study keynote panel this morning at CloudCon Integration. Now, as promised, it's time that we drill a bit deeper into some of the more notable technologies here at today's event. And for this session, I'm rejoined by Corey Scobie, Vice President of Technology at SOA Software. Corey, welcome back.
Thank you very much, Vance. Happy to be here.
Thank you. In his post at SOA Software, Corey helps drive the firm's foundational governance and management for SOA, enterprise APIs, and a variety of integration governance needs. Prior to SOA Software, Corey was an IBM Chief Strategist for the Appliance and Applications Optimization Unit and came to IBM from the DataPower acquisition in 2005. He brings 15 years enterprise networking, data center operations, and software experience to his current post, so he has a terrific integrated or holistic approach to this new world of enterprise APIs. In his session today, How Does My Enterprise API Differ from Facebook, Twitter, and Netflix?, Corey's going to take us on a tour of how companies are more and more using these API techniques to extend their traditional SOA architectures to allow a governed, manageable, and secure way to deal with discrete communities of developers, partners, and even customers. Just a quick reminder, if you haven't already done so, you can download Corey's slides by clicking the Download Slide button at the right. And we love your questions here at CloudCon Integration, so to connect with Corey, just type into the Ask a Question box. Corey, it's your turn now. Tell us more about how does my enterprise API differ from Facebook, Twitter, and Netflix?
Great. Thanks, Vance. I think this is a very exciting topic to talk about, and I'm happy to be here today. I want to talk a little about how enterprise APIs differ from the great case stories that we hear often in talking about APIs and API management around the web economy companies. It's not very often that you hear a discussion about open APIs or APIs in general without some discussion of or somebody dropping the name of Facebook, Twitter, Netflix, Amazon, Salesforce.com. And I think that they've all provided some fantastic legwork and cues and patterns that we can use in developing a successful API management program. What's interesting is when we look at the requirements for an enterprise API management program, there's a few differences that the traditional Fortune 500, Global 2000, brick-and-mortar companies in non-web-oriented economy segments have, whether you're a manufacturer or in some type of industry, even technology companies that are more oriented towards consumer electronic products and whatnot, often have a lot of other requirements that factor into how they design a successful enterprise API management program. The primary thing I think to start off with to remember is that enterprise APIs, as opposed to purely open web APIs, are typically not created in a vacuum. And here at SOA Software, the way that we look at that is that they don't just materialize out of nowhere. They actually start or are conceived of by some collaboration between typically enterprise architects, line of business folks, and certainly the intelligence of the engineering, research, and development core. So we like to look at the enterprise API space as something that starts at the conception of an API and the lifecycle concludes at the consumption phase of an API. And for that, we've actually broken it down into 4 different categories. You can see we talk about plan, build, run, and share. And I'm going to talk about that a lot over the course of the next few slides and through the course of this presentation. But plan, build, run, and share is the entire life cycle from conception to consumption. And so with our enterprise API management platform at SOA Software, we've actually broken it down into discrete products that address those various different phases of interaction. For enterprise architects, we have a architect-specific tool that helps with portfolio planning, defining business metrics for the success of the program, etc. We have a full suite of tools for developers that help with the development governance of APIs and also helps them with trying to use the fundamental SOA building blocks that probably exist in most enterprises today as the basis for the API program going forward. We have a suite of tools that are focused on managing both the APIs themselves and the traffic associated with those APIs, and it's really focused on enterprise API managers and systems administrators. And then, of course, we have the whole community aspect, which is all around collaboration, and the developer community support that's required to have a successful enterprise API program. So it's no surprise that as a leader in the enterprise SOA governance space, we had a wealth of technology to draw from as we evolved our enterprise API management platform from the basic building blocks that we've built over the last decade plus in the SOA space. So the next thing I want to do is I want to look at what we really have found as some of the key success factors for enterprise API management platforms. And there's really three key ones that we want to look at here. The first one is that SOA assets are the basis for our enterprise APIs. And we'll drill into this in a little more detail in another slide, but the idea is that, again, for most legacy customers or most customers that have something beyond just a web economy presence, they actually have SOA assets and have built up SOA assets in their middleware architecture that are going to help them drive their enterprise API program going forward. They may be fundamental building blocks. They may be able to expose some of those SOA services directly to business partners and channels in the outside world. The second key success factor is systems integration with the enterprise infrastructure. Most of these companies have a tremendous investment in their middleware architecture, in the surrounding security services, and in their network monitoring and infrastructure. And one of the common trends is to try and build an enterprise API program and an enterprise API platform as an island outside of that. And we've really found that it's critically important that you treat this similarly to the middleware infrastructure, that you provide the appropriate hooks for systems administration to leverage the existing enterprise assets that help you do things like unified authentication, authorization, etc. The last key success factor that we're going to look at is flexible deployment model. And this is a real challenge for a lot of customers because as we are at a cloud-based conference here, there's a lot of customers that want to try and use their enterprise API program to expand the application footprint to include cloud-based services or cloud-based applications. And they may, in fact, want to take some of those APIs or the hosting location of those APIs and actually place them outside of the bounds of their enterprise as well. Having said that, there still tends to be a large percentage of assets that exist in current data centers or current data center infrastructure. And so having a flexible deployment model and the ability to choose a deployment that meets all of those criteria or maybe even multiple deployments that they can federate across those different environments is absolutely critical. So let's take a look at this in a little more detail. We're going to look at this first point, that SOA assets are the building block for enterprise APIs. And I think you can see by the visual on the right-hand side of this slide that that's a fairly logical assertion, that many of our customers have spent the better part of the last 5 or 6 years building up a significant SOA investment, that those are represented in tens or hundreds of enterprise services that exist in their integration architecture today. And as we move up the stack towards APIs, we find that there's two main characteristics. One is that APIs tend to represent the productization of many of those fundamental building block services. So what do we mean when we say productization? We mean a higher bar in terms of documentation, a lower bar in terms of ease of consumption. So rather than just having a manual workflow where one developer emails a WSDL to another developer, and that's the invocation of the workflow for consumption of a service, we have self-service documentation and scalability where we can have developers come into our community, sign up for using an API, whether it be an open API or a private API to trusted business partners, and actually automate the workflow of facilitating that process, provide them all the documentation, the test harness, the developer toolbox, and the environment that they need, and get them up and running in an extremely short period of time, despite having no sort of prior interaction with the company or business. So that's the kind of things that we talk about when we look at productization. The other thing is bubbling up a set of APIs that expose your business capabilities at the right level of granularity for an external audience as well. So 3 key things that we look at: build the right services to support your APIs, or in some cases identify the right services to support your APIs, build your APIs and services the right way which means the appropriate level of granularity and the appropriate manifestation of the business capability that you want to expose to the outside world, and make sure that your services and APIs are running correctly. So have a high degree of visibility there, and again, that's where the Enterprise API Management Platform comes into play, provides monitoring, visibility, provisioning, and sort of eases the workflow of all those characteristics. I mentioned it before, and we're going to come back to this now. So we look at plan, build, run, and share, and this is a slightly different view of those same sort of overlapping phases of Enterprise API lifecycle. So when we look at it in the linear sense, we start with the conception of a service and we end with the consumption of a service, and that aligns pretty well to plan, build, run, and share as a linear series. But when we start to overlay it into something like the enterprise software development lifecycle that you see at the bottom of the slide, the overlap gets a little more complex, and there's obviously a place where we need to ensure that the end-to-end solution provides us the appropriate glue or connecting tissue to take the output of, say, an architect and line of business planning session, turn that into the appropriate set of development change orders or work orders that can help us build the correct set of APIs, the ability for the runtime environment to collect the appropriate set of metrics and feed that back into the planning stage as we iterate through versioning of APIs, etc. And then, of course, the end-to-end collaboration part of it, which is capturing all of the information that needs to be captured and exposing that to the community in an appropriate format so that we come out with really a self-service kind of platform that a company can use as their landing page for developers, whether that be, again, a trusted business partner, somebody that they have a close business relationship with, or in some cases an open API program, which would include everything from enterprise developers to guys in iOS application in a garage in Palo Alto. So again, plan, build, run, and share, underpinned by a strong flavor of a policy-oriented architecture, which means that instead of for each API or each message interaction we're programming something, we have the ability to apply abstract sets of policies, things that help us to overlay the appropriate set of security, audit controls against API traffic, etc. The last look I have here, and this is a busy diagram, but we're going to look at the similarities for enterprise API management and SOA governance. And it's no coincidence that SOA Software, being one of the thought leaders in SOA governance, has evolved our platform to also include the appropriate set of technologies and characteristics for API management as well. The fundamental plan, build, run, share lifecycle is applicable whether we're talking about an internal enterprise service or an external enterprise API. The constituency of users for the various tools at the various phases of the process are often similar as well. And I think the big difference here is really focuses on the community building aspect of API management and how that's really lowering the bar for consumption overall. Nonetheless, a tight relationship between the SOA architecture and the governing components of the SOA architecture and an enterprise API program is significantly beneficial to most customers. We're going to move on to the next key success factor here, which is that systems integration with enterprise infrastructure is absolutely key, and we recognized that at the outset when we were designing the Atmosphere Enterprise API Management Platform. We actually took a very API-centric approach to the architecture of the product as well, which is to say that if you look at this diagram, there's a collection of boxes in the middle that represent the fundamental services that the Atmosphere platform provides for API management. And those fundamental services are all themselves exposed as APIs within the infrastructure. They connect to broker technology that allows us to do the appropriate level of policy enforcement and audit control and monitoring and logging that are commonplace requirements for enterprise APIs. And they also connect at the top level to the Atmosphere community instance, which is really the console for managing APIs and also for publishing and also the the console that we would expect developers to use in order to be able to consume and set up the consumption relationship for APIs as well. And what's interesting here is that we made a very conscious decision to actually separate out the GUI part of the product architecture from the underlying manager API infrastructure that you see in the middle. And the reason for that is because many of our customers who are building enterprise API platforms are looking to do it in the scope of their brand or their company persona on the internet. And so as a result, we needed to be able to very quickly and easily provide a framework for skinning and providing fine-grained controls over the actual display and rendering of the console, as well as some of the things like managing and modifying the underlying workflows. An example would be where an API consumer is required not only to view the documentation, but also potentially accept some complex legal agreement that's a part of provisioning them for the API, and that may even be connected to a human workflow as well, the signature and email or faxing of a document as a result of the business relationship that's established when two entities exchange data via an API. So there's a lot of sort of underlying pieces here, but as you can see from some of the boxes that there's a tremendous amount of ability to integrate with existing platforms. Often customers are looking to leverage their existing knowledge base from a support perspective. They may have their own collaboration platform and threaded discussions forum that they want to integrate with. Often there's things like enterprise authentication and authorization that they want to interleave with the API management platform, potentially security services like key distribution, etc. So there's a lot of opportunities for integration, and we provide a platform that fully supports and enables that kind of integration so that you don't create an API management platform that's an island from the rest of your enterprise computing complex. The other important part, and I started to touch on this, is the customization ability of the community framework. So you can see a couple of screenshots here, and we've taken a very collaborative social approach to what the framework looks like and how it presents itself to a user that lands in the portal. I think it's extremely important that there's the ability to manage this in a fine-grained way because, again, as I said before, for many customers, this portal represents the future face of their business as they expand their channels and their sales partners and even potentially their own employees to using their established enterprise APIs. And so the ability to brand this, the ability to fine-tune the workflow is extremely important in that as well. The last key success factor that we're going to look at, just to refresh your memory, was flexible deployment model. And we see a tremendous amount of value in having a very flexible deployment model. Being the SOA governance leader that we are, and we are a products company at SOA Software, so fundamentally we've built the Atmosphere Enterprise API Management Platform as a fully installable on-premise solution. But with the way that the trends that are emerging in the industry and the rapid increase of cloud-based resources and platform as a service kind of plays in enterprise customers, we also saw the need at the other end of the spectrum to provide an easy-to-use, fully multi-tenant SaaS or PaaS-based deployment model as well. So on the left-hand side, we have an on-premise approach where both the community and the Atmosphere broker components are installed in a customer's data center adjacent to their enterprise services and APIs. On the right-hand side, we have a platform as a service-based approach where the installation is fully in the cloud. And we actually see many customers choosing some hybrid of the middle, where they may choose to actually route API traffic through their local physical data center, but host the community in the cloud, or in some cases, they're not comfortable with the multi-tenant environment, so we offer a managed deployment approach as well, where they have a fully self-owned instance of the product, but manage it in our cloud data center for easy deployment. So just to review, again, we have number one, enterprise services as the basis for a successful enterprise API program. Number two, to ensure that one doesn't build an enterprise API management platform as an island outside of the existing enterprise architecture. So systems integration and the ability to leverage existing enterprise assets is of key importance. And number three, a flexible deployment model ensures that you can start with the right deployment but grow into a more successful enterprise API management program as time progresses. And I think that's of key importance given some of the great data points that we see from the web economy in the past. So just to summarize here, I want to take you through a couple of more slides, tell you a little about the genesis of SOA software, but more importantly, the genesis and the progression to our enterprise API management environment. SOA software's history is we've been around for about a decade. We were one of the first governance products in the marketplace, and we have been servicing Fortune 500 and Global 2000 companies for some time in the SOA governance space. A couple of years ago, we saw the emergence of APIs as becoming a key form of business collaboration for enterprises. And so in early 2011, we announced our Atmosphere Enterprise API Management Platform, which is tightly integrated with our SOA Governance Suite, but also shares many of the same successful technology fundamentals that we've built up over a long period of time in that space. I wanted to talk a little about an interesting trend that we see. So just a little bit of a look back at Analyst Analysis in the course of the last year. As of October 2011, what you're looking at here is the integrated SOA Governance Magic Quadrant. And what's interesting, I think, is that SOA software was recognized in this iteration of the Magic Quadrant as one of the visionaries, in part because of our progressive work around enterprise API management. The other thing that I think is interesting is that enterprise API management, at least at this juncture, does not exist as a true sole category yet in the analyst community, but is certainly fast emerging as one of the strongest trends for enterprise integration for 2012. Look forward to seeing us in the next iteration of this Magic Quadrant, well positioned under API management as well. Just want to give you a very quick look at the laundry list of some of our key customers, both for SOA governance and API management over the course of the last few years that we have been interacting with, and many of them are close and reliable business partners. And with that, I wanted to just thank you, give you a few of my coordinates and the coordinates of SOA software in the social networking environment as well. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Vance for a few questions.
Corey, thanks very much. Very good look, very good architecture look, very good business look at this growing category of enterprise API and API management. And with your permission, let's go to questions. It's probably no surprise that we've got questions from both sides of the brain here, the folks that are architects and integration professionals as well as the business users. So with your permission, let's get started.
Great.
Corey, I think there was a lot of interest in terms of what kind of business engagement thinking goes into these kinds of projects. So let me just go back to the beginning here and basically refresh people's minds with the idea of the credit card example you used. You mentioned the credit card firm that used the enterprise APIs to establish what you called a next-generation payment platform. What was so next-generation about it? And are there features about it that could be used for something else beyond payments?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there's a number of characteristics that are really next generation about what our case study was trying to accomplish. The first thing is they were really shedding themselves of all of the legacy of what happens in today's payment card industry. It's a mishmash of hardware, vendors, network infrastructure. And what they found after doing some research was that there's not really a need for all of that legacy infrastructure that fuels today's payment card industry, and more importantly, is it a significant drag on their ability to actually interact with their customers, both consumers and the merchants alike. And so using an API-based approach basically gave them a software version of what they'd been doing in hardware for some 25, 30 years now. And so that in itself was significantly revolutionary. I think also they're looking to be able to significantly lower the bar for vendors to get on board. So rather than just interacting with the top tier of retail merchants, they want to make sure that, and we've seen some of this trend with other payment card technologies as well, they want to make sure that everybody that has a smartphone or access to the internet has the ability to both transact payments in a micropayment kind of environment, as well as be able to collect payments for their various goods and services. And so fundamentally, the ability for them to play a significant role in fueling the regrowth of our economy and cottage industry, et cetera, I think is quite revolutionary as well.
Well, and in fact, you bring up a question that actually relates to that from the integration or the architect point of view. And the question here reads, it sounds like the value in APIs for the enterprise are not simply the APIs themselves, but what they are connected to and how they can be governed and managed. Is that the truth?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting. APIs are basically a representation of our business value, right? So if you're a credit card company, it might be the payment process or the ability to transact money. If you're a manufacturing company, it might be information about your products and product catalogs and services. So when you look at it from that perspective, the ability to package APIs in the right way, to have the appropriate level of granularity, to be able to fuel today's mobile applications with their multi-channel, persistent sort of session-based approach where you might start your interaction with an API on a mobile phone and interact with it in the intermediate state on a web browser on your computer when you get back to your desk, and when you walk into the brick-and-mortar store, finish the transaction on a pedestal or at the actual cash register or POS machine there. I think that in and of itself talks about the complexity of some of the business processes that we're trying to manage. And so, of course, being able to manage that complexity, being able to properly document and fuel those kinds of use cases and to build the community that can help innovate those kinds of use cases.
You know, you're really tapping into a getting started sort of vein of conversation, because here's another question that relates to this whole conversation we're having, Corey. And the question here reads, can you describe a POC for an enterprise API project that could get us going in 60 days or even less? Also, does SOA software offer best practices or templates for our API approach?
Yeah, so that's a great question. On the POC front, quite often, as I mentioned in the Facebook, Twitter, Netflix presentation, many of our customers find that their enterprise API program is a derivative of some services that already exist today. So for us, often a template would be to identify a couple of services. And the customer may have done some work to sort of repackage those as APIs, but whether they have or they haven't, we can drop in the Atmosphere Enterprise API Management Platform and help them actually transform what would otherwise be an internal traditional web service into something restful and modern and documented through an API management portal and provide a test harness and whatnot in a very short period of time. So identifying a couple of basic service use cases and using those as the basis to expose some business partner related or even end user related functionality to the outside world, I think is the most fundamental business case. We absolutely provide a tremendous amount of knowledge and best practice around this. Again, with the legacy that we have in the SOA governance space, and one of the few vendors in the enterprise API management space that has that viewpoint from the SOA architect's perspective, not only do we provide best practices, but often those best practices are actually embedded in our tooling for our Atmosphere developer and our portfolio and repository manager products on the SOA governance side. We actually help not only frame but also enforce some of those best practices through the various governance steps for services or API management.
So let's get into this idea of API management. One of the questions here reads, what kind of tracking or visibility does SOA software give me so that I can see what my community is doing with my APIs and guard against unauthorized access?
Great question. So when you look at Atmosphere and the Enterprise API Management console and community, you really have two particular viewpoints. The viewpoint as the API administrator or the API publisher would provide you a consolidated view of everybody that's using your APIs, You can break down by usage, by time slot. You can get real-time statistics. You can get historical statistics. And, of course, all of the detailed auditing and logging information that would be required for security purposes or potentially even for debugging, for support and resilience purposes. The other part is that when you are an API consumer, it's also equally important to see what APIs you're using for various applications and how much of those you're using to ensure that you're within the bounds of your business arrangement as well. And so if you log into the Atmosphere Community Portal with a consumer's profile, you will in fact see the opposite side of the spectrum. You'll see all the APIs that you're connected to. You'll see detailed statistics about when you're using it, how much you're using them. And that would potentially even help you ferret out security scenarios like somebody is using your application key, for example, something along those lines. So there's a tremendous amount of visibility across the board, both statistical visibility as well as actual traffic auditing and management capability. All of the API management stuff is fully contained within the Atmosphere platform itself.
Very good, very good. Well, this has been a terrific conversation, and as is our custom here at CloudCon Integration, Corey, I'm going to leave a slide up here because we covered a lot of ground, both technology and business cases, so people can get a little better feel of what exactly is going on in this kind of incubating world from resources off your website. Thanks very much for coming to CloudCon Integration, and we really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, Ben.
Corey Scobie, Vice President of Technology at SOA Software. Thanks again.